But we know that yesterday Indigenous health and legal groups gave feedback on the federal government's plans to extend the cashless welfare card to the Northern Territory. The Senate's Community Affairs Committee held a public hearing in Darwin yesterday seeking comment on the proposed rollout to the top end set for April. Now, joining me in the studio to talk further about this and tell us a little bit more about what was said yesterday is Senator for the Northern Territory, Malarndirri McCarthy. Good morning.
Good morning, Katie. Good morning to your listeners.
It's great to have you in the studio. We talk over the phone a bit, but you usually can.
It's great.
Good to have you here.
It's nice.
Now, the hearings began yesterday. How did they go?
Look, it was really important to hear from organisations across Darwin and the top end who came in. We had the Aboriginal peak bodies. We had the Arnhem Land Progress Association, Catholic Care came forward just to talk about what they think the government is trying to do here. Yep. And just to let your listeners know what the Scott Morrison government want to do in the Northern Territory is there are 23,000 people in the Northern Territory who are on what's called the Basics card. Mm-hmm. And now the federal government want to move those 23,000 people to start with onto what they call the cashless debit card.
How do those two cards differ?
Good question. The Basics card came in 12 years ago. People may remember the Northern Territory intervention, and the Basics card came in then as a way of reducing people's welfare cash amount to 50%. So half their money would go into this Basics card and the other half would be cash. Mm-hmm. Now, there has not been really a thorough evaluation of that program. There was a report in 2014, Katie, but it was very limited. And many of the witnesses who spoke yesterday to this Senate inquiry were saying that this was like going back to the future by having another card come on top of a card they were forced to go on in the first place.
So for those 23,000 people that are already on that Basics card, it would mean that they're moved off the Basics card and moved on to a cashless welfare card, which is it pretty much the same thing or is it different?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. Yep. Obviously, the government believe it's a better card. It's one they seem to want to roll out across Australia for welfare recipients. Mm-hmm. My concern is that here in the Northern Territory, people here have been on these cards for over a decade, and there hasn't been a thorough evaluation done to see if it actually works. In my view, with the different inquiries I've had, we've seen far greater poverty, entrenched poverty. People are hungry. There are, school attendance is still an issue. One of the disturbing evidence we got yesterday before the committee was low birth rates. Related to this card, the trauma and stress that goes on people not having enough money, that it's actually impacting low birth weights for mothers, which is a serious health issue. So these are things that the Senate inquiry are taking into consideration. The Labor Party certainly has a concern about this cashless debit card being compulsory. Our view is that it must be voluntary and that people have a choice.
Now, Malarndirri, I know that there's been a bit of commentary on the social media pages about this, and I guess the common misconception has been that it's really only going to be Indigenous Territorians that are affected, but what I've actually seen is quite a few comments as well from pensioners.
It's not just impacting First Nations people. This will be something that impacts any person really who will be on welfare eventually. Unfortunately, it's always First Nations people who seem to be the guinea pigs, but there was a view even back in 2007 when this Basics card was rolled out that, this is a trial for really Welfare Australia eventually, and this is the journey that our country's going on. And I think it's most unfortunate that we seem to be looking at laws that keep people who are already struggling to keep above the water level, pushing them still further down on the poverty level.
There will be some people listening this morning who think the possibility of expanding this isn't a bad idea. Why is it so negative in your opinion?
Look, I think anything that's forced on people is always questionable, Katie, especially when there's been no evidence to say that it actually works. In fact, the evidence we do see is the reverse. Greater poverty, homelessness, people on the streets, lack of jobs in our communities. These are the things that keep pushing, people who are already in dire straits into further difficulties. We don't see any real improvements, say, for example, as I said, with birth weights with children, even going to school. So it has a roll-on effect in the social sphere. What we need to make sure in the Parliament when we have these debates is that it's all very well for people who are in pretty privileged positions to make these kind of laws for people who are struggling. But when you've suffered being in an impoverished life, it's quite shameful, humiliating. You lose a sense of your dignity, and I think it's important that politicians realise that we don't want to make it worse for people who are already in a pretty bad state.
We are going to get ready to wrap things up, but Senator, I am keen to find out, was there much feedback from different communities as well? Because I know in the past what I've heard at different times is very much when some of these changes need to come into play in different communities, that it is led by Indigenous women, and that we should be speaking to them to find out really what they would like happening in those communities. Has there been much feedback from that perspective?
Yes, look, we've certainly been able to receive advice around what happened, say, for example, at Manyulluluk when they wanted to bring in quarantining before 2007. We're certainly aware of, say, for example, the Arnhem Land Progress Association, who, with all the communities in Arnhem Land, had developed a food card, and that food card was working really well until the intervention. So we've heard these stories. It just seems like any local solutions get squashed by over-the-top government policies, and that's really where we're at the moment. But I know what you're saying, Katie, in terms of WA and the women there who've really talked strongly about their concerns. I'm actually going to be in a community tomorrow in WA where they're wanting to talk about it.
Well, look, I think it's going to be really, it's going to be an interesting one to keep an eye on, and no doubt you will keep us up to date with how these hearings progress, because I believe they're continuing on next week.
That's right. We'll be listening to further evidence and academic evidence. We need data to show, well, where is it working? These trials are occurring in Ceduna and down in Queensland, in Bundaberg, and we certainly heard evidence from people there, but they're anecdotal evidence. It's like saying, yeah, my best friend next door is doing really well because they can now feed their kids. But as a Senate committee, we need data. We need actual evidence-based data.
Yeah, which is fair enough. Well, Senator for the Northern Territory, of course, Malarndirri McCarthy, always good to speak with you. Thanks so much for coming in today.
Thanks, Katie.
Now,